Have you ever wondered what makes creative people tick? Where do their ideas come from? What keeps them energized? What kinds of things get in their way? Is their life as much fun as it looks from the outside? Hello, I'm your host, Lily Pierpont, and this is ArtStorming, a podcast about how ideas become paintings or poems, performances, or collections. Each episode, I'll chat with a guest from the arts community, and we'll explore how the most creative among us stare down a blank canvas or reach into the void and create something new. Today I'll be ArtStorming with Patrick Finnegan, who, as you'll hear, is a master storyteller. I've known Patrick for a number of years, and yet I had no idea of these magical powers. His wife, Carrie, who I met at the dump within months of my arrival in Santa Fe, has become a dear friend. She and I have taken countless long walks in the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and when I told her about this podcast project, she casually suggested that I talk to her husband, Patrick. Well, I knew Patrick had worked in many parts of the film industry and had just directed a documentary about Vietnam veterans. Since I wanted to speak to a member of the Seven Arts community and I knew Patrick to be charming, I thought, sure, why not? But I was totally unprepared for the wonder that unfolded. Now, if we were on video, you might recognize him as that handsome guy who throws the football in a well-known pharmaceutical commercial. Everyone does. But when you finish listening to this episode, you'll know him as the Renaissance man and modern-day bard that he truly is. Talking to Patrick Finnegan, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation because you and I have really never had one of these kinds of conversations, just one-on-one.
Yeah.
So I have a lot to learn about you. What I know already, I see instruments hanging on the wall. You've given me a story about a desk that you made. I know that you're embarking on or reinventing readdressing your writing craft. Mm-hmm. And you did a whole lot of stuff before that. You've been on this side of the mic, interviewing other people. Yeah. So we're just going to dive into all of it.
Okay.
Start just with whatever lights you up the most right this minute that you would like to talk about.
Well, what are you pursuing? Are you trying to look at the creative life in people?
Yeah, I'm just looking at creative process and what makes those people who get up every day and sort of just feel inspired to pursue something new and on the edge of their comfort zone and keeping them engaged in life and that process. And I'm talking to people who do that as a regular practice to help those of us who are maybe trying to fumble along and figure out how to do this as a regular practice.
Well, I think actually I have a lot to say on that subject because one of the things that fascinates me are creative people have to create. Whether they are ever known for it, whether they're ever read if they're a writer, whether they're ever listened to if they're a musician, they have to do it. Whether it's carving or whatever it is. Like, for some reason, they see the world in a slightly different way. And the discrepancy, the disparity between the way they see the world and the way the world tells them it is bugs them enough that they have to point out the differences. And I had a career for myself. I started off writing when I was in my early 20s. And then I became a single father for 18 years. And then I had a son who was diagnosed with schizophrenic disorder. And I eventually lost him, but it was a 14-year struggle. So there was this whole period of time in between when I began working as a writer and when I returned to it, a period of over 40 years of waiting and sometimes endeavoring to step back into it. I have 4 other pieces in various stages of work. But I really, until I retired, I worked to make my money in the film industry. And I worked in all different capacities. I was a construction coordinator and then a key grip and then an assistant director and then a director and a creative director.
And talent.
And talent, right. It's interesting because working in the film industry, I learned a lot about the creative process. and in ways that are never actually visible to, they're visible, but they're not understood by the layman. For instance, in working, if you think about it, people see the credits on films and they see gaffer and they see key grip and they go, what's a gaffer and what's a key grip? And in brief, the gaffer is the first head of authority under the director of photography. The director of photography is responsible for everything visual about the film that is being made or the commercial or whatever it is. What the laymen don't understand, but when you work in the industry, you begin to get, and a lot of people actually, even who work in the industry, don't ever really understand this. You have to be curious about it to really probe it. But for instance, if you think about it, electricians under the director of photography put light onto the set. They big 12Ks and 6Ks and 10Ks and everything. Everything gets lit. And then the grips come in and they create shadows. They cut light. They limit light. We take away light. Why do we do that? Because, and this is what you discover, it's really in the negative spaces that things become visible. If I just light an entire room, your eyes don't know what to see. They don't know what they're supposed to focus on. They don't know where the mystery is. They don't know where the questions are. There's something called a classic 3-act structure in drama, demonstrated by a very simple paradigm of boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy regains girl in the end. Okay, so for the layman, they hear that and go, okay, I can see that. I can see that. You know, the arc. You can almost graph it. In fact, you can. In drama classes, they graph that arc of drama. So, you know, at the beginning, everything is going up and climbing and it's rosy, and then it plummets and everything is despairing, and then gradually it climbs up and goes off the chart, you know, to the happy ending. That's a drama we all feel good about. Well, what the director of photography understands, even the writer will write those words. The director will have an idea about how he wants to film that. But the director of photography is asking the question, how do I communicate that in light and in color? Mm. And what a director of photography knows is that certain colors evoke certain moods. So when we put warm, rich oranges and yellows in the industry, it's called color temperature orange. It's a filter you put over a light to make it more daylight and warm and inviting. In the beginning of that first act, when boy meets girl, they'll saturate the sets with color temperature orange. They'll make you feel warm and promising and everything else. But then you'll notice a subtle shift. There'll start to be shadows like that get bigger or loom in the background, and they start to move toward color temperature blue. In the blue and purples and the shaded spectrums, we start to feel like wintry. We feel sad. We feel loss. There is the colors of loss. So a director is manipulating your emotions with color, and by the end, it'll go back to this dazzling golden sunset, you know, the couple on the hill. And what the director of photography has been telling you all along is look in these places in your own emotional heart for the story that we're telling. These are the signals of how to go. I'm showing you in shadows. I'm showing you in light. An additional tool that is available to the director of photography is lenses. And the layman watches this, but they don't necessarily understand. We create shallow depth of field with certain lenses that have big, wide open stops. They will mute the background. They'll defocus the background. And your eye unconsciously is trained to just the eyes of that talent, you know, with the sadness in them, and the actor's doing everything they can to evoke that whole thing. But what it does is that we throw soft focus to the background. And this is another way that we're manipulating constantly this whole thing. But what you're really getting an experience of are the tools of the artists, because it translates into every art. Whether it's in the 3 acts of a Beethoven's, symphony or the Mona Lisa da Vinci. What did da Vinci see in Mona Lisa's face that created this timeless moment? And that wasn't a photograph, a realistic, he could have probably rendered that thing exactly as it was. But what he did was he created mystery. Mm-hmm. He created question. And so when I was in my experiences with the film industry, I began to see all these different tools at work and everything else. And I really put a lot of thought into what the artistic experience was for me, because after 35, 40 years in the film industry, when I retired and I decided to attempt again to write, I had a lot of questions and fears. One, would I be able to access the id again? Would I be able to create from that place that threw soft focus in? Another thing I learned in my time in the film industry was you're searching really for the paradigm of how best to tell a story, right? And when it's interesting because there's been this movement in the film industry to go to greater and greater resolutions in cameras, 4K, 6K, 8K, 12K. But what's happened is that because of video gaming, it's had this influence on our eye. If you look at films from the 60s shot on film, they're grainy. Mm-hmm. They have a distorted, little bit of a messiness to them. The classic thing is the film reel that goes off and you see the hairs and the gate and everything else. So in the movement toward video gaming, there became this concomitant movement in our eye to want more and more clarity in the image. The problem with this is
it kills the mystery.
It kills the mystery.
Yeah.
And the reason is one day, like the aha went off in my mind. The paradigm of true art is human dreaming. When you have deep out of focus background, that's the way we dream. We see characters in our dream who are central and everything else is muted. We don't have this kaleidoscopic vision of a huge city and buildings and everything in crisp detail. Our eye is drawn by the impulse of the dream to what will arrest you, will draw you in and say, this is what I'm telling you. This is the subject of your story. This is what I want you to understand. And in that, so I got to the place where I wouldn't even shoot in 4K. I would shoot in high definition or in film, because in that muted texture of all those things surrounding the character, and in the way that I portrayed the face, it was the closest replication of human dreaming. And that is where I think the artist operates, is that the artist arrests the waking dream, draws the eye to a kind of arc of wonder, whatever it is that they're putting into the expression that is for them. For whatever reason, they're drawn to say something. How they say it and the techniques and you can, as you can train in the film industry and learn all these techniques. An artist, the painter can paint and learn all their techniques. Techniques will only get you so far. Sure. But without technique, you can't get there. Yeah. Because you don't understand what you're doing.
So let me ask you this. You said you started writing and then you had this sort of hiatus. When you started writing, did you have this sense of craft and technique? Did you sort of have this sort of beginner's mind, right, which will take you, into all kinds of glorious places. Right. But then you've got this next chapter where you're learning all this technique and you're learning about the soft focus and you're learning about colors. You're learning how to take the reader or the audience through these arcs of stories. So now you've got this new information and you go back to writing. How did that change?
It was huge.
The approach?
Because what I came to understand when I was a young man, 21 years old, I had great capacity to dream, and to be moved by the wonder of dreaming, living, waking dreams. Like my imagination was very, very alive. But my execution was very, very naive. Mm. And on some ways, you look at the 40 years hiatus in between and you go, oh, wow, you lost a lot of time there in your central passion. Like, my biggest fear the day after I retired, I said, I'm going to give myself a year just to drift and to go into dream time, to go on a walkabout and just meander and find my way again to other parts of myself that are not scheduling for film sets and whatever. So, because you have to engage the id. First and foremost, artists think about their tools, musicians think about their instruments, writers think about their paper or their computer or whatever it is. But one of the most important tools to me is meditation. It is the way I prepare for a day of writing. Like I know that I want to go into a kind of holy space where it's me and some essential voice that is prompting me. When I was a young man, I wrote constantly with my audience, my imagined audience over my shoulder. And it was near on debilitating because with every sentence I wrote, there was some part of me that was witnessing it through someone else's eyes and wondering, oh, well, will they like this or they want this or that, will this, and will they like this, like, oh, will they be stunned, and I'm now 70 as a man maturing in life and, at my age, you become aware of mortality in a way that you don't as a younger person. The future is infinite when you're a younger person. When you're an older person, the moment is infinite.
Oh, what a beautiful thing to say.
When I get ready to write for a day, I want to prepare myself to go into that infinite moment. That's what I do. And meditation is the first way to just clear out things. So that and the first thing I noticed when I returned to writing was for the first time, I was free of that audience over my shoulder. I was no longer thought about them. I was like, which becomes its own fascinating question for the life of an artist. Like, what then motivates you? Of course, I've decided to go the route of self-publication with Apple Books and everything else. And I literally have been designing the book cover. My tale involves an ancient Irish folk hero, and it's a whimsical tale full of the invention of fairy and the interface of the gods and heroism and honor and courage and all these things that are just wonderful aspects of ways to tell great stories. There's a reason these myths persisted through thousands of years of telling and retelling around campfires. So when I returned, there was a real question for me. One was, can I access my pure dream state again? Like that thing that was so generative and spontaneous and unusual. There were things that I wrote that I knew no one else had ever said that way. Like I looked at it and went, wow, that's original. That is really beautiful. And I'm moved by this. Then, as I got rid of that audience over my shoulder and really began to write for the pure accomplishment and pleasure and expression and to get this thing out on paper that had been living in me for so long, that so told so many great stories. Like, in the end, what I think the artist does in addition to plotting that arc of wonder is to tell their own narrative. Like, every artist, like when we listen to a sonata of Beethoven, there's a piece of Beethoven's story. He's just sitting down around the campfire saying, when I was a kid, and like, there is some narrative, some vapor trail of the artist left in everything that they've touched. Sure. And so whether we do that unconsciously or not, we experience it. So, but what I didn't understand as a young man, and now I do, was that the real trick is to include your narrative, but never be restricted to it, because it's not a narcissistic endeavor to create. Yeah. It's a gift that you have to give of your soul. You have to impart this part of your soul and give it over and never claim it again. Like, it's like, I'm supposed to leave this here. This is my impression left on the world. This is my, as when we would make those shadows on the set, what I understood was that it was negative space that was really telling the story. It's what you don't see. You can say it all, and that's journalism. When you give impressions and places where people are reaching and going, what does he mean by that? Where's that going? And like, where are, like, oh my God, I gotta, follow this.
Along.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Then you're leading them with these titillations of your soul, your craft, all these things. So it really became a question for me then when I noticed that my audience had disappeared from peering over my shoulder was, well, how do I write 6 hours a day, 5 days a week when I'm working. I'm taking a break right now. And I love it. I go up there every day and I think about it in between. And it's like,
But do you have to unlearn any of the things that you were talking about creating with negative space? And, you've got a good solid 40 years of technique of how to draw people into a story, how to color the story, how to put sound in the story, emotion in the story. Is there anything you feel like you've had to unlearn? I mean, so many people, artists that I talk to, talk about unlearning the technique or just like letting go of the technique and kind of getting beyond the technique.
Right. I think of technique as, if you've ever done scuba diving, technique is like the air tank on your back. It allows you to get down into the depths, but pretty quickly, in the wonder of the coral and everything else, you're limited, and the amount of time you can spend in the depths is always limited. You always have to return. Like, that's the artist's journey. Like, you dip into this unconscious world and then you step back and then you dip into it again. And each time you hope to go deeper. But in spite of it being this thing that is essential to your being able to go dive into this space, it is also something you can quickly allow yourself to forget about. It functions. I'm taking a breath, I can go deeper. I take another breath, I can go deeper. And I'm trained to know that if my tank runs out, I can actually, one of the amazing things about diving is that because it's compressed air, as you go down, that air gets more and more compressed in your lungs. And one of the fantastic things when you're diving, when you're first learning to dive, that they used to do, I don't think they do it anymore, is that they would take your tank off of you 30 feet down. And they would say, you're going to go to the surface now. And because you have compressed air in your lungs, you have to blow out from the moment you start to ascend. And it's the most amazing feeling because, and then they teach you that when the light gets brighter, you splay your arms and legs out so you slow your ascent in the last 15 feet because it has to do with the way atmospheric pressures compound as you get closer to the surface. So what's amazing is the tank is gone, you cannot take a breath, and now you're blowing out. Right?
It's really
counterintuitive, yeah. Right? You're blowing out, getting rid of the last of your air, And every foot you ascend, more air fills your lungs. It's coming out of your...
And you don't have to inhale in order for that to happen.
It's coming out of your bloodstream.
Counterintuitive. I'm sort of starting to suffocate just hearing about it. But how cool. So you just keep
blowing, and it keeps just coming and coming. And that's the faith of the creative process.
Wow.
Like once you start that ascent, you have to run the risk of having nothing to fall back on. No tank. Yeah, no tank. But then you discover this wondrous thing, this impulse that drew you at whatever time in your life that said, I have to create, just keeps bubbling and bubbling and bubbling out of you. So that was the biggest question for me, was whether I would find that place inside myself again. And when I sat down luckily I had 6 chapters from the original work I had done. And I went back and read them and went, oh my God, this is good. I mean, it needs work, a lot of work, but it's not what I remember it to be. It's not as naive as I remember it to be. And so I dove in the water and to answer your question, unlearning, I think the things that I most had to unlearn were the instructions of when I lived my own life poorly. Like the instructions of unnecessary grief, of limited viewpoint, of all these things that were not equal to the greatest aspirations that I could find in myself. When I write, I peer into some of the best aspects of my own development and my own questions and my own dreams. And I work away diligently at crafting them to the page. And, the secret magic, I think, of true art is not in telling a story, but in suggesting the possibilities in a story. Mm-hmm. The story is almost secondary to what else is going on. By the end of it, the reader should be felt, by the end of looking at an artist's painting or listening to a piece of music, I believe the reader should feel, the witness should feel that they have traveled somewhere. They have gone somewhere and arrived at somewhere new that they can look back on their memories and go, that was worthwhile. I'm better for this. I see the world in a more expanded viewpoint, or I feel something different, or I'm just happy in a way I wasn't before, like I feel belief in something. And so now with that art, with that, audience no longer over my shoulder, one of the things that becomes fascinating to me is what truly motivates. There are those who will create their entire lives and never be known. I don't know if I'll ever be read. And so my greatest experience with my trilogy to date, actually, in terms of audiences, was I have 3 grandchildren, one who's now 11, one who's 9, and one who's 7. But a year ago, when they were a little bit younger, I decided I would start to read the trilogy to them. And it's a sophisticated book in certain ways. There were many things about it that I knew were going to be over their heads. But at the same time, it had story. And so I decided, and I knew the youngest, who was only 5 when I started reading it to him, that would be, and certainly he struggled the most in terms of, like, he was really into it on the chapters of where Finn McCool is fighting the monster and, all that, right. Sword and, let's read that again. But the 2 older daughters, the first time I started to read the opening chapters to them, the youngest, who was maybe 7 or 8 at the time, I was curious when I'd get a few pages in, I wanted to watch them and see how much they were like focused, that could stay with it. And within 5 minutes, 10 minutes maybe of reading, the youngest granddaughter, Zia, got up and started fishing through her desk and getting out stuff and getting colored pencils and everything else. And I thought I lost her. And so I continued to read, and the oldest granddaughter was just sitting there raptly focused. And so we finished a few chapters, and so I was curious, and I said, and the whole time while I'm reading, Zia is like, I thought she was coloring. She had a couple of reams of paper, and she was just working away on this paper. And so I thought, she's completely gone. She's not even hearing it. So when I finished reading, I said, Zia, I just noticed that, early on when I started to read that you got up and got paper and everything. And I thought maybe, I know this book is, sometimes there's some things going on in it that are not quite your age or something, but I did, because it's important to me to know how children might hear this book. I'm curious. Did you get bored? Was that, she goes, oh, Bumpa, no. And then she held up the paper, and she had started stream of consciousness copying words that intrigued her that I was using. Oh, and she had filled an entire page. She said, the words you use are so amazing. And then the oldest granddaughter piped in and said, Bumpa, you're a real writer. Your words are incredible. Oh. And so I'm like, wow, that's fantastic. That is, and then because the oldest granddaughter stays up a little later than the younger one, my wife, Carrie, went in to read to her after I had finished reading to the two of them. And instead, the oldest one got out a pad of paper and wanted to start riffing on words, just saying words like constitutional, and she has an amazing vocabulary. And she had Carrie, my wife, write these down. And the next morning, Carrie brought them in and showed me and said, we filled 2.5 pages of words that she was just like, she said, I'm like blown away at her mind because the words she's putting, look at some of these words. And it was like, I know that it probably doesn't make any sense to say this, and it's probably suspect on some level, but if I never get read again, I've already had something in those two children's response that is cemented for what I've done already for me.
I totally get that. I mean, my God, full stop.
Yeah. And
what it makes me think of too is that when I was little, a lot of the books that I read were adult books. They weren't, I didn't have we had Goodnight Moon and Pat the Bunny when we were really little, but I really jumped from that to either adult books or maybe Nancy Drew and Hardy. I think children are much more capable, and I think their imaginations are so ripe.
Yes.
And if you give them language for these ideas, it's a no-brainer.
And it's amazing to think what they might do if at this age they're responding in that way to like this kind of direct adrenaline rush of language. I mean, one of the anecdotal things, I use Grammarly to do the final edits, to clean up the grammatical syntax and things like that. And so Grammarly is an online platform as well as you can get a desktop version, but they generate all these metrics in Grammarly based on all their users, because Grammarly is constantly correcting and editing text. So, but they'll occasionally send me these notifications saying, "Oh, by the way, here's where you are in the spectrum of Grammarly users." And one of the things that keeps standing out to me every time I get one of these things is you use more unique words than 99% of Grammarly users.
Bravo. Bravo.
Which is what my granddaughters were responding to.
Yeah.
They were responding to that richness of language. Now, given I'm writing a myth, I'm treating a myth from ancient Ireland. So there's a kind of high language. It's kind of the Damien Runyon, they're like, thus thou speaks, or, a little bit of that kind of thing. It's an elevated formal language when, good Finn, you'll not be wanting to, this, that. So there are ways in which that can account for it. But I know that a lot of it is just the way I shape language.
And where did that come from in your past? Did you spend time in Ireland growing up?
Well, good question. What first inspired this book, when I was growing up, I had an Irish grandmother who totally talked about the fairies in the trees and was very prescient. Had, we were constantly like, we lived on the same property with her on 3 acres. She had what was the old carriage house to our house. And there were any number of times where Granny would just pounding on the door and in tears, and she'd come in and we'd settle her down and she'd say, I remember this one time she came up in just hysterics and her face just flushed and tears just pouring down her. And like, she's literally hyperventilating, like she can't catch her breath. And like, we're all trying to settle her down. And my mom is saying, Mom, it's okay, whatever, tell me what happened, And so when she finally got out the story, she was sitting in the breakfast room having her tea in the morning. And suddenly she hears this buzzing that starts at one corner of the ceiling. And she said, I'm following it. It's going down. And I'm thinking that I've got mice or rats that are like, it's this weird buzzing though. And it goes all the way around the room. And finally, when it gets back to the original place it started, and she's freaking out by now, she's going to call it, the exterminators and everything else. She hears this loud explosion, and suddenly all these people are screaming in pain and calling out, help me, please. Oh my God, help me. And all this. Granny's that's all we know. So we call her sister, Aunt Bo, say, Aunt Bo, you got to get over here. Granny's going bananas. I don't know what's happened to her. And she said, what's happened? And we described this thing, and she goes, oh my God, what? She said, I just heard on the news that a Delta flight just crashed into the side of the hill on the Kentucky side and was completely destroyed, and everyone was on board as a presumed dead. And my grandmother had heard this in her own way.
In the ethers.
Yeah. And that there were all these things about her that were like that all along. So when she also was in communion with the fairies, there was a way in which it influenced me, and I was like, there was the world of Cincinnati and the 7 breweries and the German and Irish heritage and the Catholic upbringing and all that stuff. And then there was Granny, who was a little fae, like connected to something that didn't make any sense. So when I was a young man in my 20s, my girlfriend at the time and I, who would then become my ex-wife, and I split up, and I didn't know quite what I was going to do with myself. And she owned this cottage on the southern coast of Ireland that was at the foot of an old Napoleonic watchtower. They built during the Napoleonic invasions these towers that were a bonfire apart, so they could signal by bonfire all the way around if they detected an invasion. And I went there, and I was given an introduction to a man named Peter and Victory Duquesne, who lived in, I think it was Inishbofin or Kinsale, one of the places down the way. And I contacted them, and they said, "Oh, please come, come on over and for a visit. We'll have, And I got there, and Peter Duquesne had designed the first PT boat. He was a Commodore in the English Navy, and Victory was landed gentry, Irish gentry. Like, she literally had been raised formally by nannies and governesses, and would only see her parents once a day at dinner. And formally, they would all have to dress up. And she would say that oftentimes they would fake getting sick because it was the one time her mother would come in and sit next to her on the bed. And it was like, but it was, that whole. Yeah. But I remember asking Victory, I had read a book called The Fairy Face of the Celtic Countries by Evans Wentz. He was an anthropologist. And he was searching throughout the world for repetitions of myths about the fairy cultures, like the little people and the wee folks and the sprites and the wood nymphs and all these other stuff. And he find this again and again and again, Native American, African, like the same myths again and again and again. And he was just intrigued by this because what we think of as fantasy had this element of universality in the collective consciousness, right? So when I went to visit Peter and Victory, I didn't know what I was going to do with my time in Ireland. But I had this interest in kind of looking for my heritage. Like my last name is Finnegan. And so it's as they said, the people that in the community that I was living in, oh, Patrick, he's part and parcel to the community. It's like, so when I met with Victory, I said, I'm curious whether any of the old tale tellers are still around in Ireland, because I would love to go and hear them out and sure. Maybe collect some of these stories. And she said, oh, maybe up in Galway, maybe some of the Western Isles. But, it's all gone the way of television and everything else, Patrick. You're not finding. But she said, you know what I think I've got for you. It's a children's book. I remember reading it when I was in school, just as a little girl. And let me see, I've got it. And she kept rummaging through. And she was a bit of a hoarder, so things were stacked everywhere. And she's talking away, looking, and Peter's getting irritated. And finally she grabs this book and she holds it out to me. And it's a older edition of this book, leather cover kind of. And there was something about that book when she held it up and she said, oh, it's children's stories. You'll probably find it boring. I said, no, Victor, this is perfect. Man. And I took it home, and you can read this thing in an afternoon. I mean, but it was the collection of the most whimsical set of stories surrounding who was the equivalent of the Arthurian legend of Ireland. He was the progenitor of the code of chivalry and the code of honor and the protectorate of the band of woodsman warriors known as the Fianna. But unlike the Arthurian legend, Arthur had Merlin, but this legend is just abounds with the unexpected visitations of who is this creature or person out of fairy and what, and I just fell in love with this thing. I just thought, and it kind of answered something that was going on in my childhood, this deep suggestion that there was something in the world not perceived by the senses five that could express something different about our natures. And interestingly enough, many years later, I went to sought out a professor of linguistics at UCLA in Los Angeles, and to get help translating how I would pronounce some of the Gaelic words, the names and things like that. And so I brought this list of Gaelic words to him and was telling him that I was writing this book about Finn McCool. And he started to giggle. And I said, not quite sure, is something funny? And he goes, you don't really know what your name means, do you? And I go, what do you mean? He goes, you're writing the story of Finn McCool, right? And Finn, like Arthur, was said never to have died, that great heroes are taken to the Hall of Heroes and put into a deep sleep. And one day, when great heroes are needed again, they will be awoken.
Oh, man, I've got chills.
And in fact, James Joyce wrote a book called Finnegan's Wake, which was all a phonetic slur. And what that title means is Finnegan's Awake. The return of Finn as the hero. So when he was giggling, he said, you don't know what your name means, do you? And I go, what do you mean? And he goes, Finnegan. It's from the Gaelic, Aegon Finn. It means you are of the lineage of the family of the clan of Finn. You are writing your ancestors' tale.
Well, did you think he was bonkers, or did you know right away that that was true?
It was like, wow. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it was this full circle with my grandmother and the fairies and everything else. And, I had been raised without a father. And I think when I initially was drawn to the tale of Finn was because he was a father. I actually was originally started writing the story of his son, Oisin, who was ancient Ireland's greatest bard. And he had once, his father was Finn McCool, and his mother was a queen of fairy. So he was what's referred to as a half-born. He would have these, like my grandmother, he would have the daily living and daily reality, but he would have these bleed-throughs.
Where he had a foot in each world.
Yes, exactly. Which I always felt
clearly you do.
Wow. So when I started Oisin's tale, Oisin took this famous journey as a young man. He met and fell in love with a princess of Faerie, and she invited him to go travel to Tir na Nog, the land of the ever young, which is this island. When you live in Ireland, you see this all the time. The Irish are very fey, and not until you live there do you really understand why it is that they've always had this highly developed sixth sense. Because for all of European history, the world was thought of as flat. And the last outpost before chaos was Ireland. So those who lived on the edge of chaos, and when you're looking out, I would spend, this Napoleonic watchtower had 270 degrees of coastline view. Excuse me. And in the winter, when the mists are gathering constantly and everything else, you see this mysterious island appearing and disappearing constantly in the west. And everyone talks about it. Oh, yeah. And they call it Tir na Nog, the land of the ever young. And supposedly it's the land of Faerie. So Oisin was invited to go visit Faerie. And he goes on this magic steed and he arrives in Faerie and he spends 3 years. By the end of that time, he's missing his father and the men of the Fianna, and he wants to go back and see his world. And the people of Faerie keeps cautioning him, no, you don't really want to do that, And he said, no, I really do. And finally they said, okay, we'll give you this magic steed to ride on, but whatever you do not set foot on the earth. And we're forewarning you, things are going to be very different back there. What the Irish already understood, Einstein would tell us about much later, was that the closer you approach the speed of light, time slows down. So 3 years in Faerie, Oisin returns to find out 300 mortal years have passed. And men and women have diminished in stature. The great tall 8-foot heroes are no longer abound in the land and all this. And it's like serfs and peasants and drudgery and all this stuff. And Oisin is like, where are the men of the Fianna and the blackbird's call? And so eventually he's going through a field and he sees this farmer bent in toil trying to budge this huge boulder out of his field. And Oisin takes pity on him and he leans over, and he's just so powerful. I'm sorry about the coughing. And he just flips the boulder out of the field. But in doing so, he puts such strain on the saddle girth that he falls to the ground and instantly is changed into a 300-year-old man. And he's put on a stretcher and he's taken to St. Patrick. It's early Christian Ireland. And there's these amazing stories of Patrick seeing the PR opportunity, because everyone in Ireland believes this is Oisin. Like, Patrick doesn't believe that. This is some crazy old man. But the people believe it, and his job is to convert Ireland to Christianity. So if he can get Oisin to embrace Christianity and negate all the tales of Finn McCool and the heroes that come before him. And so there's these amazing debates between Oisin and St. Patrick. And St. Patrick is saying, you know your father will be burning in hell for his pagan beliefs. And if you'll not fall down on your knees and beg forgiveness of the saints in the church, you'll be burning in hell as well, And Oisin is an enlightened man by this point, right? And he just nods his head and says, Patrick. He calls him Patrick Og, little Patrick. Patrick Og. Yeah, my psalms are the blackbird's call and the letterly and the whispering of the sound of the pines. And, like he's saying nature is God to me. Like I come from this place that sees everything in such richness. And, and eventually Patrick is actually really moved by this guy.
I was going to say, it would be really great for history in all time if he had really succeeded in converting Patrick completely over
because
his...
it's unusual in Ireland. One of the few places that was the onslaught of Christianity, really tried to subjugate and they couldn't dislodge these tales from the Irish mind. So what they did was they changed the names to St. Beatrice and everything else, and they incorporated the same tales and then they Christianized them. But those tales still exist. So that was what Victor Duquesne put in my hand, was one of these original tales. And I originally was going to write Oisin's tale, and I did for 6 months work on that. And then by the end, halfway through his book, I realized his life and his legend will make no sense if we don't understand Finn McCool, his father. Finn was who inspired this man and who raised him and taught him honor and taught him, about the code of young manhood. And so that was, for me personally, my father left when I was 5. And I think like any young man, I sought instruction in the male code, and I found it in Finn. I was like, as I read him instructing his son, I go, yeah, that's what I would want to be told by my father or a mentor who was going to do. So it became an extra motivation in writing. But it circles all the way back to say, here you have this whole story, a rich story, right? And that story may just sit on its own and never be read. Like
No,
I know. One says no, but you have to be prepared for that.
I suppose you do, but I can tell you right now, I just can't wait to get my hands on it.
Well, I got 2 of the books finished, so I'll send you. You can read them.
Please.
But that's an important thing to understand about the artist, and as I know you do understand because you're an artist too, is that what do we write for? What do we create for? And like, if we create for our audience, we're dead. If we only create for ourselves, we're dead. So what do we create for then? What drives us again and again and again to return to that thing? We have some belief that there's something in the act going on that cannot be defeated. It cannot be made obscure. It cannot be, like, even down to I'm designing the book covers right now, and I literally went online and found purveyors of swords, and I found a Celtic sword, and I bought it, and then set up a photography studio in my shop and photographed this sword, and then found this Celtic shield and did that, and and then worked with a friend of mine who's really good with Photoshop, and to see this book cover come out from just your imagination, and and who owns a sword anymore? There's something in taking every one of those steps. It betrays this amazing belief you clearly have. You're preparing it for publication. You're going to put it out there. And unfortunately, I have zero interest in social media, so I'm not on Facebook or anything else. And what they say is, now you've got to promote yourself. You've got to, somehow you've got to get visible on Apple Books and have people say, hey, but I'm not the person to do that.
Well, you don't have to be. You've done plenty in this. And, I'm reminded of, there's a book by Elizabeth Gilbert called Big Magic, in which she talks about the creative process. And one of the things that she talks about is that creativity unexpressed becomes toxic. The flip side of that is that the muse, that story wants to be told. Yeah. And obviously you've made yourself a vessel for this story to come through you. And I'm thinking about that razor's edge between leaving the audience behind, and it's not your story, but you're making yourself this hollow vessel for this story to come through. And I can just tell you right now, that story has got to be told, because it picked you, and you're making it available, and it shall be. I mean, it's just so there's beautiful. A magic to this.
Lily, it's so beautiful that you pick up on that, because it is true that that's the way I feel, that it was a gift to me. And and I have other works that I'm working on that are when I finish the trilogy, I'll go on to, and each one has a unique voice that I have to do this. I have to say this. And my delight is that when I exercise my craft at such a high level, when my grandchildren say, "Bumpa, your way with words," when I know that I'm, in the end, writing is, I think, mathematical in the sense that mathematics are a pure language. Mm-hmm. You have the symbols of mathematics. You have the concepts of mathematics. But the magic happens in starting off with a question and somehow creating this pathway of pure calculation that results in this hitherto unknown, like pi, for instance. What is this thing that is at the basis of all that we build and everything else, and it's this, but it's an abstraction at the same time.
Well, it's magic.
Exactly.
It's magic that wants to be expressed, and you're in service to that.
Exactly. You put it really, really well.
We're going to end it there, and that was, I want to say, flippin' brilliant. That's all I got to say. So thanks for joining us today. Please like and follow us on artstorming.org, where you'll find a list of our shows, a transcript of this episode, with links to the guest page, as well as our other projects. ArtStorming is brought to you and supported by ArtBridge and listeners like you. Look for us on your favorite podcast platforms.